It was just past midnight when Keanu Reeves stepped out of his car on a quiet street in downtown Los Angeles. The city lights flickered like tired eyes refusing to sleep. He had just wrapped up a long day of shooting, but instead of heading straight home, something pulled him here, to a corner he had passed so many times before. Tonight, though, he felt a heaviness in his chest that he could not ignore. Across the street, near an old brick building with faded graffiti, sat a man wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. His beard was wild and untrimmed, his hands buried deep in his coat sleeves to fight the cold. A battered sign rested beside him on the sidewalk. It read, "U.S. Veteran, hungry, anything helps." The words were written in shaky letters, smudged by rain and time. Keanu stood for a moment, just watching. He had met thousands of people in his life, but something about this man's presence made him pause. It wasn't just the sign, it was the way the veteran stared at the ground, like he was trying to disappear. Keanu crossed the street slowly. His boots made soft sounds on the wet pavement. The veteran didn't lift his head until he heard the crunch of Keanu's steps close by. When their eyes met, Keanu felt a shiver run through him. The veteran's eyes were tired but still had a spark, the kind of spark you see in people who have lived through storms and somehow stayed standing. "Hey man," Keanu said softly, careful not to sound too intrusive. "Mind if I sit with you?" The veteran looked confused for a moment, then shrugged. "Free country," he said, his voice raspy and low. Keanu sat down on the cold concrete, ignoring the discomfort. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of cars and the occasional shout from a faraway street. Keanu pulled out a small brown bag from his coat pocket. It had half a sandwich he hadn't eaten on set. He handed it to the veteran without a word. The man hesitated but then took it with both hands, as if accepting a precious gift. He bit into it slowly, eyes closing as he chewed. Tears formed at the corner of his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, pretending they weren't there. Keanu watched him, feeling a strange warmth spread through his chest. "What's your name?" Keanu asked after a moment. The veteran looked at him, swallowing hard. "Mason," he said. "Mason Cooper." His voice cracked when he said his last name like it had been a long time since he had spoken it out loud. "I'm Keanu," Keanu replied, offering his hand. Mason laughed softly, a sound that was both sad and hopeful at the same time. "Yeah, I know who you are, man," Mason said. "Everyone knows who you are." Keanu chuckled too, but there was a heavy silence between them. He could feel there was more behind Mason's eyes, stories that wanted to be told but were too painful to speak. Keanu didn't push. Instead, he asked, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Mason looked away, staring at the alley behind them. "Don't know yet," he said. "Depends if I can get enough for a room at the shelter, but it's full most nights, maybe just here." He shrugged again, as if it didn't matter, but Keanu could see it did. The wind picked up, blowing cold air through their coats. Keanu pulled off his scarf and handed it to Mason. Mason tried to refuse, but Keanu insisted, wrapping it gently round the veteran's neck. It was such a simple gesture, but Mason's shoulders shook, and he turned his face away to hide his tears. Keanu felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pity, it was respect. Respect for this man who had once worn a uniform and fought battles no one wanted to see. Respect for his resilience, sitting here night after night, invisible to a world that rushed by too busy to care. "How long you been out here, Mason?" Keanu asked quietly. Mason didn't answer right away. He picked at the crust of the sandwich, staring at his hands. "Since my wife died," he finally whispered. 3 years now, lost my job, lost the house, didn't have anywhere to go. Folks don't hire old soldiers who can't sleep through the night." His voice broke. Keanu felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything that would make it better, but he knew words weren't enough. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. Mason saw him and shook his head. "Don't do that," Mason said. "I don't want your money, man. Just sit with me, that's enough." Keanu put his wallet away. He realized Mason didn't want charity. He wanted dignity. He wanted to be seen, not pitied. So Keanu stayed, They talked about old movies, about the places Mason had been stationed. They laughed at silly things, like to old friends catching up after a long time apart. Hours passed like minutes. The street got quieter, the night colder. Keanu didn't care. He asked Mason if he'd eaten enough, if he wanted coffee. Mason finally relaxed enough to tell him about his time in the service, about the medals he had thrown away because they reminded him of things he wanted to forget. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the sky, Keanu knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away from Mason and pretend he didn't exist. This man's story deserved more than a sandwich and a scarf. He deserved a second chance. As the sun rose behind the city skyline, painting the street in shades of gold and pink, Keanu made a silent promise to himself. This was just the beginning. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but he would find a way to help Mason stand up again. Keanu looked at Mason, who was now dozing off, his head resting against the wall, the scarf snug around his neck. Keanu smiled softly, feeling hope bloom in his chest. Sometimes, he thought, it only takes one person to care enough to change everything. And in that quiet morning light, Keanu knew he would be that person. The morning air was crisp when Mason woke up to find Keanu still sitting beside him. The street had started to come alive. Cars rolled by. People hurried to work with steaming cups of coffee in their hands, not sparing a glance at the man huddled under the blanket. But now, Mason didn't feel as invisible as before. He rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, and saw Keanu looking at him with that same patient, gentle smile. "Hey," Mason croaked, his voice raw from the cold. "Thought you'd be gone by now." Keanu shrugged, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air. "Wasn't ready to leave," he said simply. "Come on, let's get you something warm to eat." Mason hesitated. Years on the street had made him suspicious of good things, but Keanu's eyes told him he didn't have to doubt. He pushed himself up with a soft grunt, folding the blanket neatly before standing. Keanu gently took it from him and draped it over his shoulders instead. They started walking down the street. Mason's steps slow and uneven from stiff joints and nights on cold concrete. They found a small diner that had just opened. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted through the air like a promise. Mason felt embarrassed at first. The windows showed a row of clean tables and people inside reading newspapers, warm and dry. He stopped at the door, suddenly aware of the dirt on his coat, the smell that never left him no matter how many times. He found a public bathroom to wash in. "Maybe I shouldn't," Mason started. But Keanu put a hand on his shoulder. "No one's gonna care," Keanu said firmly. "And if they do, that's their problem. Let's go inside." The warmth wrapped around them like a hug. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, looked up when they walked in. For a moment, she seemed ready to say something, but then her eyes landed on Keanu's face. Recognition flickered there, but she didn't squeal or pull out her phone. Instead, she gave a small smile and led them to a corner booth away from the big window. Mason slid into the booth, eyes wide. He hadn't sat on a cushioned seat in months. When the waitress poured them both hot coffee, Mason's hands trembled around the warm cup. He brought it close to his nose, inhaling the scent like it was the sweetest thing in the world. "Order whatever you want," Keanu said, opening the menu. Mason shook his head. "Just coffee's good," he mumbled, but Keanu didn't accept that. He flagged down the waitress and ordered eggs, pancakes, toast, and extra bacon. Mason watched him, a smile creeping up on his tired face. "You're too good, you know that," Mason said, voice barely above a whisper. "People like me, we're used to being told to move along, not sit down and eat breakfast with a movie star." Keanu leaned back, wrapping his hands around his own cup. "You're not people like you," he said. "You're Mason. You served this country. You deserve a hot meal and a place to sleep. That shouldn't be something special." Mason looked away, his eyes misty again. He took a careful sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The food arrived, steaming and smelling like heaven. He ate slowly at first, but soon he was devouring the pancakes, not caring that syrup dripped onto his beard. Keanu didn't say a word about it. He just smiled, glad to see Mason's belly finally full. After breakfast, They sat for a long while, talking about nothing and everything. Mason told him about the dog he used to have, a big shepherd named Duke who had protected him when he first ended up on the street. Duke had died last winter. Mason didn't say how, but Keanu could see the pain in his eyes. I keep thinking, I should have done better, Mason said, staring into his empty mug. Should have saved more. Should have asked for help sooner. But pride's a funny thing, you know? You hold on to it until there's nothing left but that. Keanu nodded. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just listened, and that alone made Mason feel more human than he had in years. When the waitress brought the check, Keanu slipped her a generous tip that made her eyes widen in surprise. She didn't say a word, only pressed her hand to her chest and thanks. Outside, the morning sun was bright, but the air still bit at their skin. Keanu knew this was the moment that mattered, the choice to do more or just walk away. He looked at Mason, really looked at him, and asked, "Do you trust me?" Mason laughed bitterly. Trust? Out here, that's a word that gets you hurt. Keanu nodded, understanding. Then don't trust me yet. He said softly, "Just come with me today. Let's get you cleaned up. Maybe see if we can find you a place to stay tonight. No promises. Just today." Mason studied him for a long moment. The city moved around them, honking cars. People glued to their phones, all too busy to see what was happening right there on the sidewalk. After a long pause, Mason took a deep breath and gave a small nod. "Okay, Keanu," he said. Just today, as they started walking toward Keanu's car, Mason asked, "Why me? You could help anyone. Why'd you stop for me?" Keanu slipped his hands into his coat pockets, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe because I know what it's like to feel alone in a crowd," he said quietly. "And maybe because the world needs to see people like you, really see you, not just look away." Mason didn't say anything after that, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a ghost drifting through the city. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could still come back from the edge. Keanu's car was warm and smelled faintly of old leather and pine air freshener. Mason sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. He hadn't ridden in a car for months, not like this anyway. He could still feel the grit of the sidewalk under his nails, the cold air clinging to his clothes. But here he was, sitting next to Keanu Reeves, driving through the wide streets of Los Angeles as if he belonged there. Keanu glanced over and gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You doing okay?" he asked. Mason shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Yeah, just feels weird. Feels like I'm dreaming or something." Keanu chuckled, the sound warm and honest. "Well, if you're dreaming, I promise I won't wake you up yet." They drove in silence for a bit, the city rolling by, tall buildings, murals on walls, people hurrying about their day. Mason caught sight of a few other homeless folks huddled under blankets, cardboard signs resting by their feet. His chest tightened. He knew them. He'd shared bread with them, shared silence when there were no words left to speak. "We're all the same out there," Mason murmured, half to himself. "One bad turn, one lost job, and boom, you're sitting on cold concrete wondering what the hell happened to your life." Keanu didn't answer right away. He just nodded, eyes focused on the road. "It's not fair," he said finally, "but maybe it doesn't have to stay that way." They pulled up in front of a small community center tucked between an old bookstore and a laundromat. The sign was faded, but Mason could read it. Street Brendan's Outreach. The center looked ordinary, chipped paint on the door, a rusty ramp railing, but inside, it was warm, filled with voices, and the smell of soup. Keanu placed a gentle hand on Mason's shoulder before they got out. "These folks are good people," he said. "No judgment. They'll help you get cleaned up. I'll wait right here." Mason looked at him, fear flickering in his eyes. "You sure you won't just drive off?" Keanu didn't flinch. "Not going anywhere," he promised. Inside, Mason was greeted by a woman named Maria. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a voice that reminded him of someone's mother. She guided him to a small shower room, handing him a fresh towel and a bag with clean clothes, warm socks, a simple t-shirt, a sturdy jacket. Mason stared at the clothes like they were made of gold. The hot water stung his skin at first, washing away layers of grime and sadness. He watched the dirt swirl down the drain, felt the steam wrap around his tired bones. For a few minutes, he just stood there, letting the water carry away memories of cold nights and empty stomachs. He scrubbed until his skin felt raw but alive. When he stepped out, Maria handed him a disposable razor and a small mirror. Mason's reflection startled him. The man staring back looked so much older than he remembered. His beard was patchy, his eyes red, but underneath it all, there was still Mason Cooper, the man who had once stood tall in uniform, who had laughed with his wife over burnt toast, who had dreamed of a quiet life and a porch swing. He shaved slowly, carefully, as if piecing himself back together. When he was done, he put on the clean clothes and stepped out into the hallway, where Maria smiled wide. "Handsome," she said, patting his shoulder. Mason chuckled. Embarrassed but grateful. Outside, Keanu leaned against his car, scrolling through his phone. When he saw Mason, his eyes lit up. "Look at you," Keanu said, his voice full of real pride. "You look good, Mason, really good." Mason ran a hand over his clean-shaven chin, feeling the smooth skin, still not used to it. "Feels weird," he said again, but this time he was smiling. Keanu opened the car door for him, like he was welcoming an old friend instead of a stranger he'd just met the night before. As they drove away from the community center, Mason stared out the window. The world looked different somehow, the same cracked sidewalks, the same crowds, but he felt a little less like a ghost and a little more like a man with a chance. Keanu pulled into a small diner parking lot, not far from where they had breakfast. "Thought you might want to call someone," he said, holding out a simple flip phone. "No strings. Just thought you might want to hear a voice you miss." Mason's hands shook as he took the phone. So many numbers he had forgotten. So many people he had pushed away because shame clung to him like a second skin. He scrolled through his mind, trying to remember who he could call. Finally, he dialed a number, his brother's. He hadn't spoken to Tom in years, not since the night they fought about money, about Mason's drinking, about pride. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Mason held his breath. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cautious, older now. Mason felt his throat tighten. "Hey, Tom," he whispered. It's Mason." Silence, then a choked sound, a laugh that turned into a sob. "Jesus, Mason. Where are you? Are you okay?" Keanu quietly stepped out of the car, giving Mason space. Mason wiped his eyes, tears running down his clean cheeks. "I'm trying, Tom," he said, voice breaking. "I'm trying to come back." Tom's voice trembled, but it was strong enough to hold Mason up. "We've been looking for you, man. Mom's gone, but Dad's still around. Come home. Please come home." Mason closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of that word. Home. It tasted like hope. He wasn't there yet. He knew the road would be long, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel impossible. When he ended the call, Keanu got back in, sliding behind the wheel. He didn't ask for details. He just looked at Mason, eyes soft with respect. "Ready?" he asked. Mason nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice stronger than it had been in a long time. "Ready." The next few days felt like a strange, gentle dream Mason didn't want to wake from. He and Keanu spent hours together, riding through the city in the old car, talking about nothing and everything. Sometimes they just sat in quiet, watching the people rush by on crowded sidewalks, both men thinking about how the world could be so busy and yet so lonely at the same time. One morning, Keanu took Mason to a small barber shop tucked between a thrift store and a bakery. The place smelled of aftershave and fresh bread drifting in from next door. An old man named Al ran the shop. When Mason walked in, Al looked up from his paper, his eyes narrowing, then widening in surprise when he saw Keanu standing behind Mason, giving him a thumbs up. "What we doing today?" Al asked, clapping his hands together. Mason shifted on his feet, feeling awkward. "Guess I could use a trim," he said, his fingers brushing the shaggy ends of his hair. Al didn't waste time. He guided Mason into the chair, draped a faded cloth over him, and got to work. As the scissors snipped away months of rough nights and cold mornings, Mason stared at himself in the cracked mirror. He watched a different man appear, someone he used to know but hadn't seen in years. A man who looked less like a ghost and more like someone who might deserve another chance. Keanu sat in the corner, reading an old magazine, glancing up. Every few seconds, when Mason finally stepped down, Al turned the chair so he could get a full look. "What do you think?" Al asked. Mason rubbed his chin, then smiled. "Haven't looked this good since my wedding day," he said, his voice catching just a little. Keanu grinned. "Ready for what's next?" he asked, handing Mason his old jacket, now freshly washed. But Mason felt something twist in his chest. For a second, he hesitated. "What if it all falls apart again?" Mason whispered, his eyes fixed on the barber floor. Tiny clumps of hair scattered like pieces of the past. Keanu stood, resting a hand on his shoulder. "If it falls apart, we'll put it back together again," he said. "One piece at a time." Mason didn't say anything more. He just nodded, his throat too tight for words. Outside the barber shop, Keanu took him to meet someone he called Claire. She worked at a small outreach office that helped homeless veterans. Claire was younger than Mason expected, but she had eyes that told him she'd seen a lot of pain and refused to look away from it. She greeted Mason with a handshake so firm, it made him feel strong just standing there. She sat him down with a cup of tea and asked questions no one else had bothered to ask in years. Where did he serve? Did he have any medical issues? Did he need help with his paperwork? Mason felt his hands tremble when he tried to answer, ashamed at how lost he was in his own life. But Claire never made him feel small. She wrote down everything, nodding like every detail mattered. After hours of forms and soft encouragement, Mason stepped outside into the afternoon sun. He blinked against the brightness, feeling like his eyes were new. Keanu leaned against a tree, scrolling on his phone. When he looked up, he asked, "How'd it go?" Mason let out a slow breath. "She says I got benefits I never claimed. Says I should have been getting help years ago. Says I can get into transitional housing by next week if all goes well." Keanu's smile was so wide it made Mason's heart squeeze. "That's good," Keanu said. "That's really good." But later that evening, as they sat on a bench outside a coffee shop, Mason's smile faded. The sun dipped behind buildings, shadows creeping in. The warmth of the day gave way to a cold that settled deep in his bones. Double quotes Keanu. Mason said softly, staring at the steam rising from his cup, "Why are you really doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why not just hand me a few bucks and move on like everyone else does?" Keanu was quiet for a moment, his breath misting in the chill air. "My dad left when I was young," Keanu said finally, voice low. "My best friend died when we were kids. My daughter was stillborn. My wife died in a car crash. I know what it's like to feel like the world wants to break you in half." Mason looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, he didn't see the movie star. He saw a man who carried his own ghosts. A man who didn't let those ghosts stop him from sitting on a bench with someone the world ignored. "You think helping me will fix that?" Mason asked, his voice raw. Keanu shook his head. "Nothing fixes it," he said. "But maybe helping you helps me too. Maybe it reminds me we're not alone." "Not really." Mason felt a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. For the first time in a long time, he felt the cold, yes, but also the warmth of another human heart beating close enough to hear. And right there on that worn bench, Mason believed, maybe not in miracles yet, but at least in this moment, in this tiny space where two broken men sat side by side, the world seemed a little less cruel. The next few days felt like they moved too fast for Mason's fragile hope to keep up. One morning, he woke up on the Cottage Street, Brendan's shelter. Sunlight pouring through the dusty window. The small room smelled like soap and fresh sheets. For a moment, he panicked, his mind racing back to old memories of waking up under bridges, on park benches, in alleys that smelled like stale beer and regret. But then he heard voices downstairs, people laughing, plates clinking, and he remembered. He wasn't out there anymore. Not today, maybe not tomorrow either. Keanu was waiting for him in the lobby, holding two paper cups of hot coffee. Mason noticed how everyone who passed by gave Keanu a small nod or smile, but no one rushed him for pictures. It was like they all understood he was here for something deeper than fame. "Sleep okay?" Keanu asked, handing Mason the cup. Mason nodded, wrapping his cold hands around it. "Best in a long time," he said, but there was a quiet fear in his voice. He sipped the coffee, staring at the tiled floor. "Keanu, what if I mess this up?" he asked suddenly. "What if I get that room Claire promised, and I ruin it like everything else? What if I'm just too far gone?" Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You won't ruin it," he said, steady and sure. "You're not the same man you were when I met you on that sidewalk. Look at you, Mason. You got cleaned up. You called your brother. You're fighting." Mason let out a shaky breath. "I'm scared, man," he whispered. "You give me all this hope and I don't want to lose it again." Keanu nodded. "Then don't do it alone," he said. "It's not weakness to ask for help. You served your country. Now let someone serve you for a while." Later that day, they went to meet Claire again at the outreach office. She had good news. The paperwork had gone through faster than expected. Mason could move into a transitional apartment. That week, something clean and safe, a place with a door that locked and a bed that was his alone. Mason's hands trembled as he signed the papers, each signature feeling like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep but desperately wanted to. But as they stepped out of the office, the city felt bigger than ever. Mason caught sight of an old friend from the streets, a man named Pete, who still slept under the bridge by the freeway. Pete's clothes were in tatters, his eyes dull with hunger and something darker. Mason's chest tightened. He knew that look too well. "Hey, Pete," Mason called out. Pete's eyes flickered to him, but didn't quite focus. "Got a buck?" Pete asked, voice hoarse. Mason reached into his pocket, but Keanu gently stopped him. "Wait," Keanu whispered. "Let's do more." They bought Pete a meal and sat with him on the curb. Mason listened to Pete's story. How he'd lost his leg in Iraq. How his wife had left. How he'd started drinking to make the memories stop, but the bottle only made everything worse. It hit Mason so hard he felt sick. He realized then that for every Mason trying to stand up, there were thousands of Petes still drowning. When they finally walked away, Mason felt the old shame creeping back in. "What good is this, Keanu? We helped him for one meal. Tomorrow he'll still be under that bridge." Keanu looked at him, eyes serious but kind. "One meal's not enough, I know," he said, "but it's a start. You know how I knew you were worth helping? Because you were willing to help him even when you had nothing left for yourself. That's the man you really are." That night, Mason lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Pete. He thought about the years he'd wasted drowning himself in guilt. He thought about how many nights he had begged God to just take him so the pain would stop. But now there was a sliver of something else, something that felt like purpose. The next morning, Mason asked Claire for a list of names, veterans like him who were still out there. He wrote them down in a battered notebook Keanu gave him. He told Keanu, "When I get my place, I want to come back here. I want to find the ones who are lost, sit with them, like you did with me. I want them to know they're not alone." Keanu's eyes shone with quiet pride. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. One by one, they spent that afternoon walking the streets, Mason stopping to talk to people he once shared corners and benches with. Some didn't recognize him at first, his clean hair, his new jacket, his eyes that looked alive again. But when they did, they hugged him, laughed with him, and listened when he said there was a place they could go. Not everyone believed him, but that didn't stop him. He knew some would never come, but if he could help even one, it would be enough. He felt it in his bones. This was how he'd pay the world back for the second chance Keanu gave him. When the day ended, Mason and Keanu sat on the shelter steps, watching the city lights blink awake. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. To men, both a little broken but still here, still trying, Mason looked over and said, "I think this might be the start of something good." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, Mason, it really is." Mason moved into his small apartment on a rainy Thursday morning. The place was nothing fancy, just a single room with a small bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the busy street below. But to Mason, it felt like a castle. The first night, he lay on that thin mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tap on the glass. He didn't hear sirens in the distance or the shuffle of feet passing by his sleeping spot under the bridge. Instead, he heard the soft hum of the city and his own steady breathing. He didn't sleep much that night. Too many memories crowded his mind. The smell of wet cardboard, the taste of stale coffee in the morning when there was nothing else, the sound of people's footsteps, always passing, never stopping. He thought about the look on Keanu's face that night they met, how he had sat on cold concrete instead of just handing over a few bills and leaving. It still didn't make sense to Mason why a man like that would bother with him, but it had happened. It was real. The next morning, Mason stood in front of the tiny bathroom mirror. He pressed his hands against the sink, studying the lines on his face, the new haircut, the eyes that looked a little less empty now. He still saw the scars. He still felt the old pain, but he also saw something else. A man who had survived, a man who was still trying. Keanu came by that afternoon with 2 bags of groceries. Mason laughed when he saw him balancing the bags. Awkwardly, "You don't have people who do that for you," Mason teased, shaking his head. Keanu just shrugged, a sheepish grin on his face. What's the fun in that? They unpacked the bags together, bread, eggs, cans of soup, fresh fruit. Mason felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost knocked him down. But it wasn't the food that did it. It was the fact that someone cared enough to remember what he liked, what he needed. After they put everything away, they sat on the floor, their backs against the bed frame, sharing a couple of apples. The window was cracked open, letting in the smell of rain and city smoke. "So what now?" Mason asked, taking a bite. "What happens when you go back to your life?" Keanu looked at him, eyes gentle but clear. "This is my life too, Mason. Helping you, this is part of it. And now it's your turn to decide what you want to do." Mason thought about it. He knew the streets would keep calling him back, not because he wanted to go back, but because he couldn't forget the people still out there. People like Pete, who might never trust a shelter again. People who needed more than a meal and a blanket. "I want to help," Mason said, his voice steady. "Like you helped me. I want to sit with them, talk to them, get them to trust themselves again. I want to remind them they're still worth saving." Keanu's smile was wide, proud. "Then that's what you'll do," he said, "and I'll help you get started." In the weeks that followed, Mason visited the outreach center every day. He started small, handing out coffee, giving directions to shelters, sitting on cold benches beside men who hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Word got around, the vet with the scarred hands who didn't preach or judge, but just sat and listened. He went back to the places where he used to sleep. He found Pete again, brought him warm clothes and hot food. He told him about the apartment, about the paperwork, about the day he signed his name like it meant something. Pete didn't believe at first, but Mason didn't stop coming back. One night, Mason sat on the sidewalk next to a young woman wrapped in a torn blanket, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. He told her his story. He didn't sugarcoat it. He talked about the nights he wanted to die, the mornings he woke up wishing he hadn't. And then he told her about the night a stranger sat with him on the cold concrete and didn't walk away. She looked at him, tears slipping down her dirty cheeks, and asked, "Why'd he do that for you?" Mason smiled, his eyes shining in the dark. "Because sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you you're still here. You still matter." From the other side of the street, Keanu watched Mason with the young woman. He saw the way Mason leaned close, the way he listened, the way he didn't flinch from her pain. A quiet pride filled Keanu's chest. He knew this was only the beginning. One night, months later, Mason sat on the same corner where he and Keanu had first met. He looked up at the stars peeking through the smoggy sky. He felt the ache in his bones, the weight of all he'd seen and done. But he also felt something he hadn't felt in years, peace. He knew he couldn't save everyone. He knew he would lose some along the way. But he also knew he wouldn't stop trying. And in the back of his mind, he knew that every time he sat down next to someone, every time he offered a hand instead of turning away, He was repaying the night when one man did the same for him. Sometimes, Mason thought, it really does just take one person. And sometimes, that one person shows you that you can be that person too.